Hi, I'm Amy Ketchum.
And I'm Amy Cassio.
And you're listening to the AA Horror Highway. And today we're going to talk about Carnival of Souls, the psychological horror film from 1962.
It was more than just not being able to hear anything or make contact with anyone. It was as though for a time I didn't exist. As though I had no place in the world. No part of the life around me.
And if you haven't seen this, or if you need a refresher, let me tell you about the plot. Mary Henry is enjoying the day by riding around with two friends, but everything goes wrong when challenged to a drag race and their car gets forced off of a bridge. The car sinks into the murky depths and all three women are assumed drowned. Sometime later, Mary emerges unscathed from the river. She relocates to a new city where she finds herself unable to assimilate with the locals and becomes drawn to the pavilion of an abandoned carnival. So this is an American independent horror film, written, produced, and directed by Herc Harvey. This was his only feature film. He also starred as the most prominent ghoul of the movie. It also stars Candice Hilligoss, who pretty much did this just for the money. They gave her $2,000, which would be about $17,000 today. And she is still alive today at the age of 83. So, Amy Ketchum, how did you discover this movie?
Well, I discovered this movie after its 1989 Renaissance, is what they refer to it as. It was a re-release, redistribution that happened. So my actual discovery would have been probably the mid-1990s. And I remember it was a Friday night, late night movie on Chicago's WGN. And I think I just read it in the TV guide. Like, that's what I always did.
Oh, really?
I just read the description and I thought, hey, that's going to be my movie tonight, because I usually sat up and watched the late night WGN movies each weekend. And how did you discover this movie?
Well, Amy Ketchum, I discovered this movie because of you. Because you talk about it.
Shut up about it.
Yeah, you talk about it all the time. And so when we started doing this podcast, it was like, we should probably just talk about this movie because you're so into it. And so I just hadn't gotten around to watching it until we decided to do it for this episode. So that's how I discovered it, is extremely recently. I don't usually do black and white. You know, usually I'm deterred by black and white, but there's a color version, so that's the version that I watched. I know that you've probably seen both the color and the black and white.
I tried to find the origin of the colorized version, and I still haven't figured it out, but I'm pretty for sure. I would assume that the original, when it was released, the 77-minute cut version, that was the original drive-in movie theater version, and the theater version, I believe it was black and white.
Yeah.
But the colorized version itself looks like it's from the 60s, the way it has been colorized. And one of the trailers I watched, it was color. So I'm not for sure when the rest of the world got to see the colorized version, but I don't think I saw it till this year. I mean, I really don't think I did. I might have forgot, maybe I have, but I don't think I had actually watched the colorized version until just a few months ago.
So do you have any thoughts on seeing it in black and white versus color? Like, did it feel differently to you? Do you feel like it loses something in color, or if it loses something in black and white?
I usually prefer the black and white movies over the colorized ones. But when I watched this, I think initially I just thought, oh, it's pretty. You know, I liked seeing color. It was different, you know, their eyes, their skin, their hair, you know, they feel alive as, you know, compared to just watching an old black and white movie. But what stood out to me was just one particular scene. Like, to me, it just changed everything, which was towards the end of the movie. I believe she's playing the organ, and all she sees is red. Mm-hmm. And that's representing the sunset behind the carnival. And in black and white, you don't see that.
Yeah.
So in this movie, it was like her mind was astral projecting, is the only way I can describe it. It's like her mind is somewhere else. You know, she can see this stuff. And she could see that sunset, and it was drawing her in. So to me, that was just a big wow moment. Like, I think my mouth literally dropped open, which is ridiculous, but I think that's what happened when I saw that. You know, I was like, who knew? I've seen this movie probably 50 times, and I never would have known that that's what she was experiencing until I saw it in color.
Yeah, when I finished it in color, I just hit play on the black and white version, just kind of let it play in the background. And it just felt like something was missing. I was just like, I can't handle this. I can't handle not seeing the colors. It's just so muted to me. but not everybody feels that way. They feel like black and white is great, but I'm not one of those people.
Well, surprisingly enough, it's very hard to get your hands on the colorized version. I mean, right now we have it on Amazon Prime for free.
Yeah.
But I went out to get a copy, and it's like I found one person selling a copy, and it's from 2005. It's nowhere, to buy on Amazon or any other popular site. So it might be kind of hard for people even to see the colorized version.
Yeah, so I did want to say that this movie is in the public domain, so if you are wanting to watch it, you can easily watch it, like, anywhere. Like, you could go to archive.org, and it's there to download. It's on YouTube. Again, it's on Amazon Prime, so it's out there. I read that they accidentally forgot to put, like, something about the copyright on the film, so it went into the public domain without them even, like, I don't know, it felt like they didn't really have any control over it. I don't know how that all works, but...
Right, so the public domain is based on the age of something, or if you screwed up your copyright.
And they screwed up their copyright.
So it sounds like they screwed up. Yeah, I wasn't for sure if it was public domain. A lot of people say it is, but that makes sense, especially since it was re-released in 1989 by a different distributor. So we can talk about that in a little bit. But that's good to know that it's public domain. It's kind of interesting. Maybe other people will use it and make something cool of it moving forward.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that because it's in the public domain, that means that you can use it creatively, do whatever you want with it. And so I discovered today that Lana Del Rey did use a line from that movie in her song. I think it was 13 Beaches. So if you go listen to that song, you'll hear a couple lines from Mary, where she's saying that she doesn't feel like she belongs.
And my mind is just spinning right now. I'm like, I'm going to make an album. I'm going to release a new soundtrack for this movie. Yeah.
So the next thing I have is the time period of when the movie came out. Do you have anything really about that?
Why, yes, I do. In 1962, Kennedy was president. This was also the year that Marilyn Monroe famously sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President, and she died mysteriously 2.5 months later. We were in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. TV sets welcomed the Beverly Hillbillies, while airwaves embraced the release of the first Beatles single, Love Me Do. John Glenn became the first man to orbit the Earth, and the first flavored potato chips were sold. They were salt and vinegar.
Ooh.
And as far as other low-budget horror movies, the popular trend at the time were oversized bugs and end-of-world disaster themes. So this movie was pretty unique when you put it up against those other types of low-budget horror.
I love that you have all of those details for the time period. So in my notes, my time period section just says 2 years prior Psycho had come out and Twilight Zone was out on the air. And this movie seems to have been influenced by both, which we can get into deeper later, I suppose.
Yes.
So if we get into the history of the making of the movie, I believe you have some things you would like to tell us.
Why, yes, I do. Herc Harvey was returning to Kansas from a vacation in California when he passed the Great Saltair, an abandoned amusement park, which looks like absolutely nothing else on the planet. So, of course, it caught his attention, and he saw this amazing, blood-red sunset behind it, and he wanted to film something there. He just didn't know what. So when he got back to Kansas, he approached John Clifford and asked him to write something. He said, write whatever you want, it just has to end up at the Saltair Palace with the undead dancing on this huge dance floor. So the beauty of creating this way is that they were basically in a vacuum in this little town in Kansas. They weren't being influenced by Hollywood or anybody. They were isolated. They had complete freedom to create. There was no outside cultural influence or opinion. So John Clifford wrote it in 1 month. And they raised about half of their $30,000 budget over that first weekend. And then they filmed the whole movie in just 3 weeks. So I thought to me, that's really interesting because when you watch this movie, the characters are really dry outside of our main character, and they really are talking like people in those industrial films. So I don't know if they were directing it that way on purpose, but it sure seems that way. It sure seems like it's meant to make her front and center, and everybody else is kind of in the background. They're just kind of blah.
Yeah, that's kind of like I've read people saying that's kind of like David Lynch. I mean, I love David Lynch and all of his stuff. So some parts of it remind me of him, which obviously would mean that he was influenced by this, which I believe he said that he was influenced by this movie.
Right. Eraserhead is the one that people usually relate back to this. So they see a lot of this in Eraserhead. And it was when he was actually doing Twin Peaks around 1989, 1990 that he actually gave credit to this film as being some type of influence.
Yeah, and then I think I read The Lost Highway. There seem to be similarities with like the man that's very pale. It's been a long time since I've seen The Lost Highway.
Yeah, and in Mulholland Drive, there's a drag race.
Yeah.
Dangerous Road.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, as far as the history of what influenced this movie, quickly we can say, oh, Psycho. Obviously the scenes where she's in the car.
Yeah, totally.
Are reminiscent of Psycho.
Totally felt it.
But Herc Harvey says he's more influenced by older, silent films like Cocteau. He references specific scenes. For example, when the creepy board mate, John Linden, is that his name? John Linden, is peeking through the door. That's straight out of a Cocteau movie. Like he was recreating a scene. Or when she's laying in her bed, totally disturbed after she drank her pot of coffee, which I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
That's straight out of a Bergman movie. So, he was, I guess all filmmakers are influenced by those who come before them. So those are the two that he cited.
Movies that I am not familiar with because it's hard for me to get into movies before the 80s. It has to be special if it's in the 60s and the 70s. Before the 60s, it's almost like just not going to happen for me.
I have tried many times to go back and watch the ancient movies, like turn of the century, and they're very hard.
It is. The only thing I wanted to add about the history is that at the time that this movie came out, I don't know if you mentioned it, but it didn't really receive any attention, so he considered it to be a failure. And so he was very discouraged by this and by the lack of success, so he just never really did another feature. I mean, I read that he tried a couple things, but there were some budget issues and some things that fell through, but this was the only thing that he really ever did. And for 25, 30 years, it was just kind of like a dead movie, I guess, until, like you said, it came back in the 80s. And then they all lived to get to see the success of it. But then he died like a few years later of cancer. But we did get to see the resurgence of the movie and how it started to become a cult classic in the 80s.
Right. So basically distribution is where it died. So they created their movie on their low budget. They were excited. And, they'd never made a feature film before. They were part of Centron, who, had private agreements. And they were commissioned for work, So this was like a brand new thing, finding a distributor. So they went with a new group that had great promise. It was called Hertz Lion. And the film was released as a double feature with another film called The Devil's Messenger. Mm-hmm. And because of the double feature, they actually ended up cutting 9 minutes out of the film. And Herc Harvey went on vacation. They'd released this film. It actually went over well in Europe. And they pointed out that the Swedes were particularly excited about this movie because they got it, which I found really interesting. They said that the explanation was that at the time, they were more open and welcoming of ghost stories and paranormal and things like Poltergeist, which Mary Henry is a poltergeist. We just don't really see her that way, But that the Swedes were like really excited about this movie. So he went off on a trip. He comes back and he's like, hey, this thing's making a ton of money. Where's our money? And basically the president of this Hertz Line distribution group went to Europe on a vacation, took all the money with him, and they never heard from him. They never saw a penny.
Really?
Yeah. So that was the end of it.
Did you find out how much it made at all, or
no? I don't even know if they know, but yeah. So he basically took the money, and that ended their distribution with them, obviously. And also, all the people who had donated money didn't make any return on their investment. Yeah. So it was just a real sour thing for everybody. People like Candace, I guess, got their salaries, but the people who had invested in this movie didn't get any of it back.
Yeah, so I like to do the inflation calculations. So It was made for $33,000, which would translate to about $275,000 today, which is still not a lot of money, but there you go.
A marketing fun fact was that when it was released, the trailer actually includes a statement about it being so emotionally alarming that they will absolutely, under no circumstance, give you a refund.
That is just crazy to me that was happening. Because that was happening with, like, didn't that happen with Psycho?
Yeah.
Where
and Night of the Living Dead.
Walking out or fainting or something. It's just insane.
Right.
And now we have, like, full-on, like, torture porn, whatever you want to call it, where people are just being whatever. Not my kind of movie, but doesn't really faze me to watch that kind of thing.
Right. So, to add on to the later release part that you mentioned earlier, it was a group called the Panorama Entertainment Group. They redistributed the film in 1989, which was 27 years later. So that's when MTV and Entertainment Tonight and Siskel and Ebert and all these different outlets started reviewing it and started to give it some type of notoriety. And that's when it became a late night classic. Like, it started to become a cult classic then in 1989. So that's why it started to appear late night, because they had re-released it in small art houses as opposed to big theaters.
That is something that I really miss about the 80s and the 90s and cable, is getting to watch the most random stuff on TV at night, like the late night B movies, like Up All Night with Rhonda and Gilbert Gottfried and Elvira.
Right.
I hate it. I hate that it doesn't exist.
Well, there's still a few late night ghouls out there. I can't think of their names right now, but...
But, like, nobody has cable anymore. It's just, there's something about watching it with people at the same time that's different.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that they are bringing that sort of thing back, because there's several different TV shows that are being produced where they're going to have, like, a host and then tell, like, a scary story.
Right, and it's like each city, in the 70s and 80s had their ghoul. Like, we had the cool ghoul, so I don't know what we want to call him, but the late night horror host. My father actually the other day was telling me about one that he remembers from the 60s. I don't remember what it was called, but I didn't realize they were doing it then. But that, even back then there was a late night horror show and horror movies. But it seems like every city had their own version, maybe.
So what I remember, I think it was the 90s, is that we had the local channel, whatever the local channel was, in Ohio, in the Cleveland-ish area, was Big Chuck and Little John. Did you ever hear about them?
No.
Well, it was like this guy, two guys who would do like comedy skits and then they would play horror movies.
It actually sounds familiar. I mean, there's so much we forget. I kind of recall a tall guy and a short guy.
Yeah, he's a short guy, a little person.
Yeah.
Big Chuck and Little John.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do these weird random skits. And I just remember them having very uncomfortable looking like chairs all the time, like fold out chairs. You can actually find this stuff on YouTube still if you like look up Big Chuck and Little John. And there's that very prominent laugh that one of them had that they would play in between every commercial break, which was just insane.
So, what's kind of sad about a movie like this is that, they went for 27 years before it became a hit, and they didn't even know it was happening, because like you said, it's a public domain. So I'm assuming that's what was happening at the time, is that this other group was doing distribution of it, and no one really knew it was going on, because they could. So they basically learned through newspapers. And I thought this was really a funny story and interesting, because like Candace Hilligoss said, she was on a subway or something reading the newspaper, and she saw it said, "The movie that will never die." And she was reading it. She had no idea it was about her and her movie. She just thought, oh, okay, I'll read this, And that she was just totally floored that people actually cared about this movie. Mm-hmm. Like, it was just so random, 27 years later. And then she said she was sitting in her hairdresser's chair, and he was bragging about, how one of the ladies who comes in is a movie star. And she's like, but I'm a cult movie star. And she showed him the newspaper. So yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to watch their story, sitting there on stage in 1989 talking about how shocked they were that it just fizzled out 2 years later because of that bad distribution, and then all of a sudden there it is again.
Yeah.
The most interesting part of that interview was the man who plays John Linden.
Mm-hmm.
is a really interesting person. Like, he did a great job being a creep. Like, he seems like a really nice,
creepy,
interesting person.
Well, yeah, I just thought, being neighborly and all that. See, I haven't eaten anything either. I just thought we had to ask you out to dinner.
Oh, that's very thoughtful of you, but I can't accept.
I know. We haven't met or anything yet, but I just thought
I'm
we'd be in the
sorry.
same
You
house.
have to excuse me.
Look, there's a real nice restaurant, right down the street, and I just thought, well, I'm just kind of guy who doesn't like to eat by himself.
I've made arrangements to eat in my room tonight.
He's actually, he was a drama student at the time of it at Kansas University, and now he's, or he was in '89, a professor at the University for Drama. Just some extra information, because I was really caught up earlier watching all this interview footage I've never seen before. It was really cool to kind of step back into 1989. Herc Harvey was saying he had just gone and seen Back to the Future Part 2 in the theater, and he said while he was watching the movie, he thought just one of these tiny little effects cost more than their whole budget.
Oh my god.
Egg whites.
Really?
Dried egg whites. Yeah.
That's what they used on their face?
Yeah, and then that's what Night of the Living Dead used that 6 years later.
Yeah.
Which is what tied them together. People like to compare those two, that they actually took that from that.
Yeah, I did read that George Romero said that he was specifically inspired by this movie to make Night of the Living Dead. And it's very obvious when you look at the zombies.
Yeah, and one thing I learned was that they had 4 times the budget for Night of the Living Dead, and I just don't see it when I watch it. It's, if I compare them side by side, Carnival of Souls is more interesting as far as scenery to me. There's not a lot going on, but, Night of the Living Dead, you're in one house, the whole movie, in a cemetery at the beginning. And then in Carnival of Souls, you're at a church, you're at the Saltair Pavilion, you're in a house. It just seems like they did so much with such a tiny budget, because often we think of Night of the Living Dead as having a tiny budget, and then today I learned they had 4 times as much money. It's crazy.
Yeah, that could bring us to the cinematography a little bit. It just feels special to me when I look at it, like thinking about the fact that this is from 1962, and it creates a certain atmosphere, but it just feels like it just feels special, like watching it. Like, I don't have exact words for it, but it just feels like they were, like some movies, they're just boring with the cinematography, but it just feels like interesting to watch. And maybe that's why I'm not bored. I'm watching an old movie and I'm not bored because they shot it in a way that makes it interesting.
Yeah, the effects are really simple. Obviously they didn't have much of a budget, so they're using mirrors a lot. The man appears in the mirror as her doppelganger, really. But also, when they're in the car, when she's driving in the car and he's in the passenger side window, it's a really interesting effect. It's not him. He's not solid. Like, how did they do that, right? Mm-hmm. So they said it was a mirror trick, that they used multiple mirrors to create that reflection on the window. So, that's what you do with a small budget, I guess. You just work with what you have. They have some great shots of the camera being out of focus, things waving, from scene to scene as she enters this weird... It's like she flickers in and out, right? She's flickering into this other weird dimension where everything's quiet and silent and people can't see her or hear her. And I felt like they did a lot as far as her cinematography with the close-ups of her eyes. Mm-hmm. Like, she's really good at, like, making you feel like she's in a panic, or, that things are getting really, like, closing in on her and she's just in this state of anxious panic.
Yeah.
So I felt it was all really, really well done.
I read that with the black and white, because I didn't really watch the black and white, so I don't know if it translated over to the color version, but they said in the black and white versions they used 2 different kinds of black and white. So, like, when she was in her, whatever you want to call it, her panic or her dream state or whatever it was, when she was silent and everything was silent, they would use a certain black and white for that. But then when she would go back to normal, it would be like normal black and white. In quotation marks. Yeah, you can definitely see that in the black and white.
I'll have to rewatch the color though and see how that translates.
For your 51st time.
So what'd you think of the music?
Yeah, if we talk about the music, this is set to an organ score. It was interesting because I can't think of any other movies that have so much organ happening in them. it's just interesting, and maybe that's another reason for why it feels interesting to me to watch, because I'm seeing something I'm hearing something I don't usually hear. Mm-hmm. It just felt very unique to me.
Well, I mean, they're working with what they have, so I think one of the main things they had was access to a factory where they make organs. Mm-hmm. I think it was called Reuter, there in Kansas. And, so that's a big part of the movie then, because that's one of the few places they could film that she is an organist. So I don't know if she really can play the organ in real life. I thought she did a pretty good job if she's faking it. But the soundtrack was by someone called Gene Moore. And so the whole soundtrack is organ music. And it's supposed to give us that otherworldly feeling, which I think it does pretty well. Mm-hmm. There's one particular scene where she's playing, and I think it's the scene where he fires her at the church, because she goes from playing this kind of pretty organ music to this like truly otherworldly. It like sucks you in. It's really hypnotic and different. It's like not that different, but it's like you can tell it's different. I don't know. I can't really put my finger on it, but that's when the man comes up, the minister, and he's like, "What are you playing?"
Profane, sacrilege. What are you playing in this church? Have you no respect? Do you feel no reverence? And I feel sorry for you and your lack of soul. This organ, the music of this church, these things have meaning and significance to us. I assume they did to you. But without this awareness, I'm afraid you cannot be our organist. In conscience, I must ask you to resign.
Yeah, they're in church. It's not appropriate
Right.
for church.
Right, and that shows you how over-exaggerated these characters are, as far as things just like really, the world is like turning on her, is what we're supposed to see, right? So, he's really over-exaggerated when he fires her. Like, all he has to do is say, play a hymn.
Yeah.
Don't play that again, but
Yeah.
instead he fires her.
Yeah. So, Amy Ketchum is very obsessed with organs. Amy Ketchum plays the organ, and you have an organ. How many organs do you have at your house?
I have a pump organ that's probably from like circa 1900.
Oh my God.
That's what is in my house. And it's a small portable organ. It's a sensible organ.
Is that what's in the background there that I can see?
Yes.
A small, sensible organ. It's probably like 100,000 pounds.
No, it's not too bad. It might be 20 pounds. It's really light. Yeah, I mean, when you think of a pump organ, usually they're really tall and, they've got 2 keyboards. And usually they'll have like a mirror on them and they're like really decorative. But this little tiny organ will fit in the back of your car. And would you like to know the story of the organ? Why I have it?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So my grandfather was a reverend and my grandmother was the organist. And what happened was, early in their relationship, he was working with somebody who happened to have this organ in their horse barn, and it was covered in a pile of manure.
The one that you have right now?
Yes.
Okay.
It was covered in a pile of manure, and when he saw it in this person's barn, he knew that my grandma would want it. And which is crazy because she never, ever would have wanted anything covered in manure, right? So my papa talks to the man, works out a deal, and the guy's like, yeah, you can have it. And so he took it home, and he started cleaning it and everything. So, yeah, so he like restored this organ, and what they started doing was they started using it for their tent revivals. So that's what they did back in the early 40s in Kentucky. There's lots of towns that didn't have churches. So my grandparents would get up at the break of dawn, this is so crazy, and they would drive to a little town with this organ in the back of their car and a tent and some chairs, and they would set up a tent for the local people to come have a church service. And they would stay there all day in the sun, which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So that was the journey of the organ. And then, when I was around, back in the 80s or something, my memory is that she would take it in the back of the car to our family reunions and play it there. So that's where the organ came from.
So, I feel like when I pressed play on this movie, because I had no idea there would be organs in it, I pressed play, I see all this organ stuff. I feel like I unlocked something about your personality and your way of being. your life
Right.
and also why you love this movie so much, because you are so
Right.
into organs. So it's
Right,
like
it is
a
a
little
thing.
yeah, it's a piece of you that's been unlocked for me.
Well, the organ to me is special because it's different from a piano. You know, when you play a piano, you hear notes, right? When you play an organ, it sustains, right? So it is an otherworldly instrument, if there truly is one. That's how I view it.
So do you actually have to play without shoes? Because in the movie she was playing with like bare feet. Do you do that? Is that
No.
necessary?
No. Well, for my type of organ, which is a pump organ, that means there's no sound unless you pump your feet. So you have two pedals and you pump them back and forth, and the billows open and the air goes in. For the type of organ she was playing, those are actually chords that she's playing with her feet down below.
Okay.
And I have seen other, like famous organists play without their shoes. So it is a thing. It might be because she had a heel on her shoe, I don't know.
Probably. That would make sense.
But yeah, I mean, the sound of an organ is unlike any other instrument because it sustains and it's, when you start playing minor chords, it's like this dark, mysterious place, unlike anything else.
Yeah, an organ just naturally sounds really creepy.
Yeah.
So it works in a horror movie.
Right. And she was playing a really special organ. The organs that they make at that factory are, they fill up a room, all the pipes.
That was
it's
crazy.
Not a little organ you put in your house.
I was trying to figure out, is that one organ or is that pieces of an organ all over the place? Mm-hmm. Is it an organ factory?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was one organ, that whole room of pipes.
Just insane.
But that's what they use in the big churches. I mean, that's a really old tradition, The bigger the cathedral, the bigger the organ.
I can't imagine trying to learn, because I guess you could only learn by going there. You could probably learn on something smaller, but I imagine there's differences that you'd have to learn, but you can only do that by going there to that location.
Right, yeah.
All right, so if we talk about themes, I mean, I liked the movie because it felt to me like she was defying the social conventions. She was subverting the norms of the times.
It's just a job to me.
Well, it's not quite the attitude for going into church work.
I'm not taking the vows. I'm only going to play the organ.
There was also certain church expectations, the job that she had as an organist. They expected her to be a certain way, to take part in these church gatherings and activities, but she was just I play for pay.
Right.
Which is hilarious. She's I'm not, I don't need to get involved in all that.
We'll have to have some sort of reception. They want to meet you.
Couldn't we just skip that?
Skip that? Well, I don't suppose it's an absolute necessity. I don't know what some of the ladies will say.
If they say I'm a fine organist, that should be enough, shouldn't it?
And I appreciate that as somebody who is not religious. I did not grow up as being religious in any kind of way. Mm-hmm. But I did appreciate that, she's constantly breaking these social conventions.
Well, see, and that's why I like the history of who these people are that made this and what they were doing, because they had such a deep knowledge of human behavior, on this sociology level, that I feel like that is what they were trying to convey here in this kind of twisted way. What if a woman behaves like this, Like in 1962, this, to me, from everything I know, she's acting way out of character compared to how other women would have been acting.
Yeah.
So it's really on purpose to make you feel something, to make you feel uncomfortable, to make the men in the movie uncomfortable. There's a lot going on here with the creators of this trying to manipulate our emotions, I think. Mm-hmm. As far as how a woman is treated, and how, what's happening in her life. It's like twofold. It's is she going to cross over? Is she going to stay here? But then also in her real life, she has this ongoing threat around her. It just keeps changing shapes. So the way I would describe the theme was that she's trying to assert her identity into what society wants her to be. So it's a threat to her autonomy.
Yeah.
It's all around her. It's around every corner. As she pushes back, it just keeps happening. She's got men explaining, mansplaining, passing judgment, condescending to her. We see a theme of closed minds with a lack of sympathy.
Leering at her.
That's ongoing.
Being creeps. Ugh.
My room's only a couple of feet from yours. Ain't likely to get very far from me, are you?
Right, like there's no sympathy, which is really odd, because usually a character in a movie at some point has some kind of sympathy from somebody, but no one relates to her. She's just like totally detached in a way. The whole world around her is becoming nightmarish. Like everything is a threat. And it just keeps getting worse. It's really unsettling and stark. So like you've got the pushy minister, you've got this grabby doctor. I don't know if you noticed that. He like grabs her the first moment he meets her. He's like shaking her, you know, when he tells her he's a doctor. And he refers to her condition as hysteria.
There was someone else there. That strange man was there.
Now look, you've had a fright. Hysteria won't solve anything. Now control yourself.
Which, you know, at the time of this being filmed, it was already recognized that hysteria is a gendered insult, right? Like for 10 years, it had been seen as an insult towards women to call them hysterical. So it's no accident that they use that word in this movie to show us this threat. Like everything's a threat. Like even the guy who's going to be her therapist is insulting her. It's weird. You know, and then from the bird's eye view, we've got, like, if we step out of her human interactions, she's doing the same thing with the man who's following her, the ghoul. It's like she's trying to assert her identity of being a living creature, a living person, so that he'll stop trying to take her wherever he's trying to take her. It's like she's trying to assert herself with both of them. Like they make it clear she's not a spiritual person, but then she's not accepting, you know, the science of what has happened to her. You know, like she's not accepting either. It's just everything around her is just getting more and more skewed.
That's bringing me to, like, because you're saying something about women and hysteria, and there was something about sex and creating a vibrator to treat women's hysteria about sex. No, not about sex, but about their sexual desire. Yeah, they were saying, like, if a woman becomes flushed and happy from an orgasm, that she was said to have had hysterical paroxysm. I don't know how to say that. But I don't know. Yeah. There's a whole thing with women and sex and hysteria and doctors and vibrators being created for it. I don't know. It's
yeah. I think the generic way of viewing hysteria was that it's anything that a woman does that is out of the ordinary and emotional. It does not apply to men at all because it has to do with the woman's hormonal changes and sex organs and everything. And they were making women have hysterectomies and stuff, you know, sending them off to mental hospitals under the term of hysteria. So, I mean, in 1952, I looked it up, you know, it'd been 10 years before this movie that they stopped using that term. So they very, very purposely put that in this movie.
So that could take us into the next theme to get away from the men calling women hysteria, where she's regularly talking about how she wants to be alone in this movie. And so before the ending happens, because the whole ending of this movie is she's dead, you know, but this could have been the moment. This whole movie is the moment before she dies, where she's trying to, like, stay on Earth and, like, not quite passing over into death. It's kind of like that moment. But before we get there, like, the amount of how she's talking about, like, how she really wants to be alone, like, I was connecting with that because I like being alone a lot, and I just want to be left alone a lot.
My dear, you cannot live in isolation from the human race, you know.
But then it's like in the movie when it actually happens, she becomes very terrified because people suddenly can't see her, they can't hear her, she can't hear anything else, and then she becomes terrified. So it's kind of like, I sort of felt like that was the theme of the movie, or like, I don't know that they were intentionally trying to say it, but it seemed like she wants to be alone, and then she gets it, but then she's terrified, and then she comes back to reality, and then she's actually really happy to be back. And so it kind of sent this message to me to appreciate what you have around you while you can. It's not actually as pleasant as you might think. If you were to actually completely disappear so that people could no longer hear you or see you, it's actually truly terrifying when it really happens. Like, I just kept seeing that happen over and over again. So that just made me rethink wanting to be alone all the time.
Well, see, and I got something totally different out of that, which was that, 1962, she's a good-looking woman. She's probably I'm making assumptions here because we know nothing about the character, but she's probably come from a place of men constantly trying to talk to her, staring at her, trying to help her, explaining things to her, all this stuff that we see these characters doing. So to me, when she's in that other realm and people can't see her or hear her, it's almost also kind of like it's because she's used to people's attention all the time. Like I felt like there's something about this character who, even though she doesn't like it, and even though she wants to be independent and have full autonomy and be herself, whatever that may be, it's like her life has been all these other people coming in and out of her life. And we see that when the minister takes her to the Saltair Pavilion, and she says to him, "Can you take me there?" Mm-hmm. And that's so foreign in 2019. Why is she asking him to take her there? Why can't she take her foot and step over the line and go in?
And she even says that, because he's like, no. And she's like, but it would be really easy to just step over this.
Will you take me in?
My goodness, no. It isn't safe out there anymore. That's why they put up this barrier.
Be very easy to step around it.
Right. Why does she need a man to take her there?
I don't know.
It just seems like that's part of this character, is that it's 1960s. She's feeling these threats of her autonomy, which to me just basically means that she's not able to be herself. There's always something telling her she has to do something different. She can't fully do what she wants. So yeah, I just kind of took that from that. Like, why does he have to give her permission?
Which sort of goes into the article that you sent me about how this could be a movie, like a queer awakening. Like people who are having a queer awakening or a queer coming of age might be able to relate to this in this movie. Not saying that this movie is queer, gay in any way, but it's kind of the same sort of story where, again, like we mentioned, she doesn't fit in with like the social conventions, which is the same thing that a queer person would feel when they're trying to come out and they're feeling oppressed by what they are, and they keep trying to come out about it, but people are like rejecting that. But it's a very interesting article that I think we should probably link into the show notes, talking about this whole subject.
Right. Alienation, isolation. She actually says, "I don't belong in the world. Something separates me from other people."
Don't belong in the world. That's what it is. Something separates me from other people.
I think that can apply to queer people, women, any marginalized group.
Yeah.
I think that's part of why so many connect with this movie. They feel that, they feel a moment in their life where they can relate to this character.
Yeah, because there was like a flash of a second where I thought maybe she could be gay when the doctor is like, "Don't you want a boyfriend?" And she's like, "No, I don't want a boyfriend." But then she was like, "I don't want anybody."
You have a boyfriend here or back home?
No, and I have no desire for one.
Never?
No. I'm surprised to find myself saying that. But it's true. I have no desire for the close company of other people.
And I was like, all right, well, that's out. She's definitely not. This is not about being gay. But yeah, it basically mirrors a queer person, like trying to find their place in the world and being unsure of how to behave. It's an interesting article.
So another theme we have is the skewed reality. And, like I said, I've seen this movie many, many times, and it was not until recently that I realized that the opening scene, which is looks really poorly produced,
oh my God,
was on purpose.
That opening scene.
It was totally on purpose. I mean, if you watch it closely, you'll see that their mouths don't line up when they're talking.
I noticed. I had to put on captions
on purpose.
because I was like, I don't know what they're saying here.
See, I never understood why the start of the film was so poorly produced compared to the rest of it, and now I know it was on purpose. It was to represent that her reality was already becoming skewed. Their voices don't line up. It kind of feels like we're overhearing a conversation, like it's an overdub where, it just doesn't even sound right when the men are talking. And the technical term is world building. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to go ahead and create a world and throw us into it. It's like these are really fine details that are quickly overlooked. So therefore, did they really do a good job of it? Probably not. But it's like everything starts out skewed, like how the title of the movie is crooked and wavy, like it's trying to prepare us of what's to come. Everything's going to be a little bit off.
Yeah, like I felt when I pressed play, it felt very jarring because you're just dropped in, and I'm like, did I miss something? Like, is this, should I rewind this movie? But no, that's the beginning. You're just like dropped right in.
Right. Well, yeah, and Herc Harvey said that was like his only regret was not developing Mary, like not giving us that backstory.
Mm-hmm.
Like they wanted to just drop us in, like that's what they wanted. But after the fact, they're like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. And also what we don't know is that the car that she's in with the other two ladies, they're actually driving her to Salt Lake City. That's where they're going. But no one tells us that while we're watching it. Like they're actually taking her to her new job. So when she gets out of the car in the river, she basically is just like, on a mission.
Mm-hmm.
Like she doesn't stop and think about what's happened to her. She just goes home, gets her stuff, and drives to Salt Lake City for this new job.
Yeah, she happened to, like her friends died on the way to her destination, but she just keeps going.
Right. Doesn't even faze her. But I feel like the movie's supposed to become more and more frustrating. It's supposed to make us feel that way. Like, that's why the characters don't connect with her. Or, they're condescending. They do all these weird things. It's like all these extra characters are there for a reason to show us the reality. And then she's got her skewed reality of that man following her.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the reality is supposed to be really jarring. Like we've got that super creepy guy, he's totally appalling, right? And repulsive. He's just like nonstop, trying to get her to go out with him.
John Linden.
Right. And it's so far from her reality. Like her reality is that there's this creepy thing following her and she's in a nightmare. And this guy over here is just focused on himself. Like no one can really see her or help her. It's this ongoing, frustrating feeling that they don't connect. They don't show her real kindness. They get irritated with her quickly. It's almost like they are aliens. Like they're aliens in human form, and she's just like trapped there.
Mm.
And I think it's supposed to represent that her world around her is just going to keep becoming more and more frustrating and nightmarish until she finally gives in and goes with these people.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I hope. I hope that her normal, regular life was not like that.
Yeah.
Before this incident. That would be really miserable.
Yeah.
So to me, the car race was foreshadowing for the movie. We could say that she doesn't have her own space, right? Like they're traveling, they cross the bridge, they get pushed off the bridge. It's men pushing them off the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's who she's interacting with the whole movie is men telling her what she can or can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And then even when she gets out of the water, she just has this little tiny small patch, this little sand dune or mud patch or whatever it is that she has to climb up on. And to me, that's some type of foreshadowing because she's in the male gaze is what they call it. Like every man that she comes in contact with, they see her how they want to see her or how they want her to be. They don't really see her as who she is. They don't care who she is. They don't try to connect with who she is. They see what they want to see.
Mm-hmm.
The minister sees her as a church-going person, even though she has told him more than once she's just there to play.
I play for pay.
I play for pay.
To me, a church is just a place of business.
Well, that's a funny way to look at it.
Why? People seem shocked because I took a job in a church, and I regard it simply as a job. I'm a professional organist, and I play for pay, that's all.
It's like he almost thinks he can, like, yeah, you say that now, but, he's going to work on her maybe,
Mm-hmm.
It's like all these men have their own motives. And, like, I just felt like that was foreshadowing where they get pushed off a bridge by men.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. It's just weird in general. Like, what guy is going to drag race a girl and push her off a bridge?
It's weird.
That's probably not going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a reason it happened, that way. It could have been a car of women. It could have been two cars of women that, and they push them off. But so that was foreshadowing to me that she just does not have her space and that men are pushing her around.
Mm-hmm.
So for awards, did you have any?
I have 3 awards.
Okay, I came up with 3 as well.
Well, I give it an award for the organ music, obviously, because that's unique for me. Like, I don't usually hear organ music in horror movies that I can think of. And there's a lot of it, so it's impressive. What about one of your awards?
That actually was not one of my awards.
Really? I'm surprised. I'm shocked. That's your thing.
My first award was the best backdrop. So the Saltair Pavilion. Just seeing it, when they're driving to it. When you compare this to other horror movies of the time, they don't really have good backdrops. Like, he really looked out when he drove past that and thought, yeah, we're going to use that. Like, I thought that was really cool to just have that in the background.
That kind of ties in with my next award, which is I gave them an award for cinematography for being shot in an interesting way that kept my attention, especially for a movie from 1962.
My second award goes back to the Saltair again, which is that it's the only historical footage that exists of Saltair.
Really?
As crazy as that is, yes. If they would not have filmed that movie, we would have no idea what this place looked like, what it looked like on the inside. So that is some type of award, that there's actually historical footage now, even though it's very limited.
My third award would be for the one-liners of the movie.
I'll be taking one of those baths you're so generous with. Well, take as many as you want. I ain't one to make a fuss about a thing like that.
And I don't think that they were intended to be these comical one-liners, but to me they came off that way. Especially all the stuff about wanting to be alone, where she's like, oh, I have no desire for the close company of other people. And like, I feel you on that. Or like,
right.
I play for pay. Or when she says, when the creep brings over coffee in the morning and then she makes him leave, and he talks about how he doesn't want her to clean the cups because it ruins the flavor, which is disgusting.
Right.
And she's like, well, thanks for the coffee. It was unsanitary, but delicious.
Right.
I'll rinse off these cups.
Oh, no. Just spoils the flavor for tomorrow.
Well, thank you for the coffee. It was unsanitary, but delicious.
There's a lot of lines that I'm going to make some memes out of because they're fantastic.
I think my favorite one-liner is when the woman that runs the house brings her up a pot of coffee, and she says, don't drink that if it's going to keep you awake.
Don't drink the coffee if coffee keeps you awake. It won't.
And she says, oh, it won't keep me awake. And then the very next scene is her laying in bed with her eyes wide open awake. So my third award is her eyes. I think probably the first 20 times I watched this, I just thought her eyes were ridiculous, that she's like overacting or, But it's like the more I watch it, it's like her eyes are so expressive. Mm-hmm. They use them all the time. Like when she's looking in the rearview mirror, they do all these close-ups of her eyes. And even when she's playing the organ, she's like in some hypnotic state. So she gets an award for her eyes because they didn't have much of a budget, but her eyes were free. So it worked.
Her eyes are free.
Well, I guess they weren't. She got paid $2,000. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have any favorite kills because no one got killed. I mean, we can assume she crossed over with them.
I mean, they all got killed. Like the 3 women in the car got killed, but...
Oh, that's true.
But that's not really... Yeah. I don't look at that and be like, that was such a great kill. It's not that kind of movie.
That was an accident.
Yeah. So do you have any fun facts or trivia for us to leave us with?
Well, Candice Hilligoss, who starred as Mary Henry, only made one other feature film, and that was in 1964, 2 years after this movie. It was called The Curse of the Living Corpse. John Linden, I believe he did not star in anything else, which is actually... after I saw him on an interview, I think he was a great actor.
But you said he's a drama teacher?
Yes. Yes, he's a drama teacher. And he's not a creep. It was really nice to see him as a nice person.
That's great.
And the only other fun fact to share is I want to talk about the Saltair Pavilion because it is so freaking amazing. The Saltair Pavilion was built in Salt Lake City by the LDS, the Latter-day Saint Church. What's so interesting to me is that it was 1893. This was a time of industrialization and the railway system. So they had this brilliant idea that, actually it wasn't an original idea because there were already hotels and different little amusements being built around the Great Salt Lake. But they had this idea that they would make this huge place that they called Saltair, this big pavilion, and they would actually have the Saltair Railway so people could travel, across country. Mm-hmm. And on their way to California, they would have to drive by this place. And of course, they'll want to get off and spend some time at this place. So this building was like, you know, we can't say it's one of the wonders of the world since it's man-made, but it was like this just crazy, amazing structure. Huge. You know, it kind of had a mix between like a Russian and an Arabian look. They called them decorated onions sitting on top of it at the time. But just a very unique architecture. The reason people were coming there was for entertainment. So like the biggest bands at the time would come and play. They had the biggest dance floor. People would swim. They had swimming suit contests. But the difference with the Salt Lake from other bodies of water is that there's so much salt that you actually float.
Really?
If you can imagine it, yes. They called it corking. So you would jump into the water and you would just float. You would just pop right back up like a cork in the water, which is kind of strange. But I guess it was kind of thrilling and interesting and new. So they called it the Coney Island of the West. Since it was created by the LDS, it was really for the children and the adults to have somewhere safe and wholesome, a family place, because they felt that the other places popping up around there were seedy. You know, there was gambling and stuff going on. So they wanted to create a safe, wholesome place. But it had a huge string of bad luck. It was built in 1893. And the first tragedy struck in 1925. It burned for 26 hours, and it completely burned to the ground. So that same year, 1925, they rebuilt it because it was still, you know, an important tourist stop. It still had some type of relevance. So they actually spent $500,000 to rebuild it when it originally cost $350,000.
That's a lot.
It is, especially for back then. Yeah, that's outrageous. Then in 1931 and 1939, there were 2 more fires. In 1955, there was a fire. In 1967, there was a fire. I mean, obviously, these are arson attempts, I would assume. That's too many natural fires. And then in 1970, it burned to the ground again. So in 1981, they created the 3rd version of the Saltair, which is a much, much smaller building. And it's just basically a concert venue. But they built it directly on the ground. And what happened was the Salt Lake rose and it totally swallowed it up. Like, this is just the worst luck.
I guess.
Right. So it was swallowed up, but it was still there. It was just flood damage, right? So they had to close the building. And so from 1981 until 2005, it was closed. And then in 2005, they came in and they refurbished it. So now it is a popular music venue.
Okay.
So, I mean, all the popular people are going there. All the people you like. You and your popular music. Billie Eilish.
Really? Do you think she's played there?
She played there on June 5th.
Really? Is it that big?
Yes.
Because, you know, at this point, she's like a global phenomenon.
Right, exactly.
So,
and that was the place to go.
Huh. Well, we're going to have to put some pictures on our Instagram of this place and all the memes that I'm about to create with all the one-liners from this movie, because they're fantastic.
Definitely.
So that is it for us this week. I am Amy Cassio.
And I'm Amy Ketchum.
And you should tune in next week where we are going to continue to talk about horror movies.
Yeah, you don't want to miss next week's episode when we talk about Summer of '84 from 2018, a Canadian horror mystery with a great 80s vibe and fantastic soundtrack. You've been listening to the AA Horror Highway.
Bonus content. So you had a ghost story to tell us.
So there was a time period of about 6 months that I stayed at my grandmother's house. I was 21, and she had just learned she was going blind. So I decided I would stay there with her for about 6 months and help her learn to do things with touch instead of sight. Anyhow, she had 2 organs. She had an organ that worked and an organ that didn't work. The organ that didn't work was her favorite organ, so she didn't want to get rid of it. And these are electric organs. So they have 2 keyboards and all the chords, and they're pretty fancy. And I was upstairs asleep, and I woke up for some reason. It was pretty late. Let's say it was 2 a.m. And all of a sudden, I heard her playing the organ downstairs. And it was beautiful. I mean, it didn't sound like anything she had ever played before.
I don't like where this
is
going.
It was more beautiful. It was more beautiful than anything I'd ever heard her play, right?
Uh-huh.
And I went out onto the steps, the top of the steps, and the whole house was just pitch black downstairs, right? And she must have been in a zone. See, my father plays piano, and he does that. He gets in a zone. He'll play in the middle of the night in the dark. I didn't think anything of it. So I thought, I'm just going to sit here on the top of the stairs. I'm going to enjoy what she's playing. And when she's done playing, I'll go down and talk to her. I didn't want to interrupt her. So I'm sitting there at the top of the stairs, and I swear to you, it was otherworldly. It was this beautiful, hypnotic, just like Carnival of Souls. It was so hypnotic. It was not like what she would normally play. And then the music stopped. So I walked down the stairs very quickly, I pop right into the room where the organ is, and she's not there.
Creepy.
And I thought, because she's old and slow, I thought there's no way she could have walked back to her room already. And so I went back to her room, pitch black, there she is asleep in bed. And I thought, did that really just happen, So the next day, I tell her and I tell my dad, they think I'm crazy. But obviously, it was real. I sat at the top of the steps and listened to it. It was loud. It filled the whole house, So let's say a week or so goes by, and I'm laying there in bed, and my bed's pressed against the wall, and I can hear it coming through the wall from downstairs at the same time of night. And that's when I realized it was coming from the organ that doesn't work.
Even creepier.
Yeah, because the organs were in 2 separate rooms, and that was the one that was directly below my bed.
Did you go back into that room? Or were you totally freaked out at this point?
That night I didn't. I just laid there and listened to it. And I think I might have heard it a third night as well. But I just let it happen. I didn't go down.
That's creepy.
It's very creepy.
It just reminds me of a time when I was laying in bed and I felt like somebody was whispering my name over and over again. And I didn't want to move, so I just laid there and let it happen until it stopped. And it was horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Well, it probably really happened.
Nope.
Yeah, I grew up in a very active house of weirdness. So when I heard the organ that second time through, it didn't really freak me out. I just thought this is some weird, something's on a loop in some other reality. I'm just going to let it do its thing. It didn't scare me, but it was very pretty music. Mm-hmm. It was really something else, unlike anything I've ever heard before.
All right, not a fan. If something like that happens again, you should record it. I imagine this was before we had smartphones.
Right. It was back in the day. It was before, I didn't have any cell phone at the time, yeah. A couple years before that.
And that was Ghost Story Time with Amy Ketchum.
Connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or Patreon at AA Horror Highway. Find us on Twitter at Horror Highway, that's Horror HWY. Also, be sure to take a moment and rate and review us on iTunes. You can find all of our social media links and more by going to horrorhighway.com. That's horrorhwy.com.